Before we explore lights in depth, let's talk a little bit about optimizing Photoshop's performance, at least within the realm of 3D. Of course, if you have the opportunity on your machine to upgrade your video card, unless you're currently running about the fastest video card you can, you will see a performance benefit inside Photoshop 3D. OpenGL drives a lot of what we see on screen, and the better your video performance, the better 3D is going to behave in Photoshop. You'll also see a tremendous difference between the way the Mac and the Windows operating systems handle 3D. At least as of CS4, a greater amount of attention has been paid to the performance on the Windows side for probably engineering reasons. But the end result is that the Windows version of Photoshop 3D performs better than the Mac version does, at least currently. So on your own machine, if you're finding that things, as we move on and things get more and more complex on screen, if you find things are really lagging to a point where you can barely interact with your object, one thing you can actually get away with in Photoshop during setup is reducing the size of your image. So if you come up to Image and choose Image Size, you can bring this down to a smaller value. You could, for example, set this to a width of 320 pixels. As long as you're constraining proportions, you would effectively be reducing the number of pixels on screen to a quarter of what you're currently looking at, so Photoshop would have less to think about and thus would perform a little bit more quickly. The great thing is, because this stuff is rendered on the fly, generated from algorithms and geometry, you're not going to lose any quality by doing this. As long as you're only working on 3D layers or the other layers in your file are smart layers, you can reduce the size of your Photoshop file to work and then res it back up later, and you'll see no loss of quality. So that's one tip. Another tip is a little bit surprising, and this may not behave the same on every machine. You may or may not see this yourself, but on this machine, on this Mac, when I switch back over to scene mode, we're working in the default render settings preset, solid. Consider working in ray traced. Now, this may seem incredibly non-intuitive to you, especially if you come from any kind of a 3D background at all, because your assumption is probably that ray traced is going to be one of the slowest modes on screen. This is certainly true in most applications because, frankly, the app has to think so hard about ray traced images and shadows and everything that ray tracing tends to slow things down. But believe it or not, in Photoshop, ray traced is one of the quickest, most interactive modes. Perhaps the Photoshop team just spent more time optimizing it, but it's actually a very workable mode. And as it happens, it's the mode you're most likely going to want to render your final output in, so that's a very, very good thing. Switching over to ray traced, you can see some shadows appear on screen, and already things look a little bit better than they did a moment ago. So now let's talk about light. And the first light, as we mentioned earlier, can be found here inside the scene panel, and that's the ambient light of the scene, as defined by this chip here, global ambient color. By default, it's set to almost black. But if you set that to a different value, say a medium blue, you can immediately see on screen that the shadows start to take on a bit of a blue tint, even bluer as we go further up, which, depending on the image that you're trying to match, might be a useful thing. A lot of shadows do tend to go towards the blue in certain scenes. In our case, however, we're not going to change our ambient color at all because we like the nice dark shadows for the drama of our scenes. Let me just cancel out of that. And up at the top of the screen, we'll click on the little light bulb, which will take us to our lights. There's a category for point lights, which there aren't any in the scene, and a category for spotlights, which there aren't currently any in the scene. And then there's a category for infinite lights, and the three lights that are added by default to the scene are, in fact, infinite lights. We'll talk a little bit more about the differences between these as we go along. It'll help, though, to visualize things to turn on the lights in our scene. Now, I don't mean that the results of the lights will turn on. They are, in fact, already rendering in the scene, but we can't see where the lights are coming from or where they're pointed. And to do that, you click on this little icon down here at the bottom of the panel. And when we do, you'll see these three blue light bulbs turn on, and then you'll see these three gray lines that are emanating from those light bulbs. Well, the little light bulbs are essentially the source of the light, and the gray line is the vector of the light, the direction in which the light is pointed. In terms of an infinite light, all of the light coming from a single light source is pointing in the direction of this vector. So in our case, the light source is behind our cup and pointed through the center of our cup towards the lower left part of the scene, and all of the light rays emanating in the scene from that light will be coming along lines that are parallel to that line. That's very useful for creating outdoor lights. The sun's light rays, for example, are parallel, at least by the time they get to Earth, for all intents and purposes. They are parallel lines. But that's less useful for things like a light bulb in a lamp in a scene, or lights that you want to point to illuminate only certain portions of the screen, for which spotlights are more useful. We're going to switch around some of these lights as we go along, so you'll see them in action and hopefully understand it a little bit better if any of that's confusing to you. The first thing I want to do, however, is change the default color of our lights. You'll see here that the lights, in fact, do each have a little bit different shading. This one's sort of a medium gray, this one's a lighter gray, and this one's a darker gray. But they're all pretty dark, and they're all kind of gray. So the end result, even in white elements, as we've seen in our scene, is that they don't get much beyond medium gray. For the sake of a goblet that's got fire inside of it, however, we're going to change our colors to more fire-friendly colors, which means yellow, orange, and red. We'll start at the top here, and we'll make this yellow. Make it a kind of a bright but not oversaturated yellow, something about 50% of the way towards white, but all the way towards the top. I'd much rather adjust the intensity of a light than set the maximum color to something that isn't fully blown out. I just feel it's more like lighting an actual scene that way. So the first light, yellow. The second light we'll make kind of an orange, about the same place. Good. And the third light we'll make red. And that one can be pretty intense. We can actually pump that up to a pretty saturated red and click OK. Now, one thing you should immediately notice on screen is that the lines emanating from our various light sources now reflect the colors that we've assigned to those lights. So by keeping this little icon on down here, you get nice visual feedback as to which light is doing what. Now, once we've changed the colors of our lights, it's time to reposition them a little bit. Things are starting to look nice and warm on screen, but the lights are not where I ultimately want them to be. I want the yellow light to be coming from behind our cup over on the left-hand side of the screen, the orange light to be coming from behind our cup over on the right side of the screen, and the red I want from the front, maybe even a little bit low from the front, giving us a nice red fill on our skull. So how do we adjust our lights? Well, first of all, let's bring the red light around the front. And with that light selected, the red one, remember we can't use our widget or object tools when we're working on individual elements inside a scene. We need to use the local controls for those elements. So using the icons that we see on the left here, let's rotate our infinite light, clicking and dragging and bringing that around to the front of our scene. Try to position it somewhere around here. And if you're struggling and can't quite get it to behave itself, just kind of get it parked close to where you see me parking it here. I'm going to show you another better, easier way to aim lights, at least a more accurate way to aim lights in just a moment. For now, though, let's come up. Our orange light, we want to be basically up here where our yellow light currently is, but with the orange light selected. And let's make this a little bit more orange. There we go. And let's drag that up and to the right to rotate it around behind the goblet up to about, let's say there. And then we'll select our initial light, click and drag to the right, and that'll rotate it around to the other side of our goblet. what we're looking for is in effect something like this. Now, if you're experiencing any kind of troubles with the lights, let me show you another really cool way of manipulating the lights, and that's to come over to your camera controls, pick the orbit camera controls, come over here, and click and drag the object around to the position where you want the light source to be. Don't worry so much about the fact that our goblet is a little skewed here, but the position where I want the light is basically the same direction that the bone is traveling. So we want this back end of the bone pointed straight at us, and we want to be approximately parallel with the top of the cup. So right about here looks perfect. If you're concerned about it, you can adjust the roll of the camera as well to level out the scene. But trust me, that really won't matter very much when it comes to lights. And now that we're here, making sure that the yellow light is selected, take a look at this icon right down here. This will jump the light to the current position of the camera. So by focusing the camera to this perspective, we're now telling it that's where I want to focus the light from. That's where I want the light to originate. So clicking on this, the selected light, the yellow light, will now jump to our camera view, which allows us to precisely focus the lights in a scene. So once again, oops, we still have our roll tool selected, so let me undo that roll and jump back around to our orbit tool, and now we'll drag to, oops, a little too far, to the other side of the scene, and we'll do the same thing. I want the second bone to be pointing towards me. I want the top of the cup to appear level, and once again, just keep things neat, we can roll the scene so everything looks level. So when the scene looks something like this, come back over, select the orange light, and click on the Move to Current View button. Okay? Great. So now come back up to our camera tools under the pop-up. Let's go back to default. That should change our view back around to the front, where things should now look as you see them on my screen. Now, if you had any issue at all adjusting the red light before, now would be a good time to adjust it, knowing what you now know about using the camera tools. For me, I'm just going to select the red light, and I think I'm going to move it up a little bit. So I'm going to click and drag up and bring it up to, for now, about here. As we play more with the textures, we can continue to fiddle around with the exact location of the lights. But for me, I'm going to come back to our orange light, and I'm going to crank the intensity up to about 1.5. So it's a little bit brighter. I may bump this down again later, but I want more intensity so I can evaluate the results on the textures in the screen when we start to modify those settings.